Hey, we're Rage Badger Gaming, and today we're going to be going over Gloomhaven, Jaws of the Lion, and Frosthaven perks. It's perk time!
Oh, he's very active. He is excited about perks. So if you are starting a fresh campaign, perk order is incredibly important and crucial to how your character advances and plays.
Highest priority. If you're playing a class that can remove negative effects on items, take that first.
It's especially important if you're using multiple of these items, or even the higher prosperity items that add 3 or 4 bad cards to your deck. It's just mandatory.
Next priority is to remove any negative modifiers or choose the perks that replace those negative modifiers.
Yeah, you'll want to remove as many as possible. So the default is remove 2 -1s. That's the best, but then you can start removing -2s, or if you don't have those options, there's usually something like replace a -1 with a +1. It's not quite as good, but those are still very good options at this point. So there's a reason why we remove cards first, and the thing is, like, we're going to go through a very basic class, the Brute. He has add a +3. That's really good, especially he's got that nice little attack 2 disarm. If you did 5 damage and disarm, that'd be great. But it's very unreliable. You have less than a 5% chance of drawing it if that's your only perk. How often is that going to happen? Not many. Not that often. So what you really want to do is make sure your good cards get drawn more often. And the easiest way to do that is to just get rid of the negative cards, especially volume of cards. So sometimes classes will be like replace a -2 with a +0, which is good, but it doesn't actually make your positive cards get drawn more often.
Right, so it's like a percentage game. It's like 1 out of however many.
It starts on 20. It's like rolling a D20. I think Isaac, who's played D&D before, used the D20 as a base, because there's one, you could actually label a die with these, the basic deck, the null being the 1 and the 20 being the crit, and then have all the other ones in between. Except the problem is, as you start drawing cards, some of the faces disappear as they get taken out of the deck, and then they all get added on once you roll a 1 or a 20.
For example, if you take a level 1 Mind Thief, your first perk, you choose to add a +2 modifier. Your chance of drawing a negative modifier is 7 out of 21, which is 33.3, repeating, of course, %. Or if you instead remove 2 -1s, your chance of drawing a negative modifier will be 5 out of 18, which is 27.7%.
Yeah, and it even though you have that higher chance of drawing that +2, which is great, you actually have just your better chance of drawing negatives while that happens. And during your low levels, when you're most vulnerable, the last thing you want to do is accidentally draw negatives, and you might not even draw any of those good stuff you add to the deck. As it gets thicker, it becomes more unreliable.
Next priority is to thin and optimize your deck by removing your +0s or replacing the +0s with a better modifier.
The remove +0 is useless and incredibly useful. At the beginning, it's not very good, but at this point, after all the negatives are gone, they're very incredibly good. Very incredibly good. Very incredibly. So once you've gotten your deck to the least amount of negative modifiers, it's good to then remove as many neutral, boring +0s as you can. Not every class has access to that, and the Brute is probably one of my least favorite set of perks. He can't remove the +0s, and you have to. It ends up being a somewhat thick deck, but nope, this was not very good. I don't like this. This is kind of why I like the Mind Thief, because the Mind Thief actually has the ability to slim down its deck a lot, whereas the Cragheart he can actually start swapping 3 of his -1s out with +1s, means there's going to be a lot of +1s in there, and then he can remove 4 of those +0s immediately after. And there's several classes that get the default perk, remove 4 +0s. Now, this is only important. The funny part is, this actually doesn't change your average damage at all if you take it as your first perk. It drastically changes your reliability. It's going to make it all over the place, and it's going to make your draws very random. However, once you've removed cards, it actually ends up making it more reliable. You're going to see the same cards more often, and you won't be like, oh, what do I have a chance to draw? Well, it's not going to be like, well, I still have 5 -1s in my deck, so why would you want to make those necessarily more common? And this is where we actually get to the numbers. And it's funny because you can see cards like adding a +3 giving you something like a 10% damage boost, which I think is pretty good. But the funny part is, if you actually add the +3 later, you're like, all right, I've changed my deck now. It actually ends up being more than a +10% damage boost. And even then, removing 2 -1s end up being about a 12 to 13% damage boost. You take this twice, and your deck has already gotten notably better. So you can actually reliably turn like attack 3s into reliably 4 damage with just a small number of perks.
Next priority is to remove all negative scenario effects.
Yeah, especially once you've thinned your deck down, some of the scenario effects are just add 3 curses. So that means when you have a small deck, the curses will be more common, or the ones that add 3 -1s, which now your deck is, they don't get removed over the course of the scenario, so it makes your deck incredibly vulnerable. So if you've got this option, take it now, and you'll be okay. Take it now!
Next thing you'll want to do is to bulk up your deck with positive modifiers.
Yeah, so you've got the option to like add a +3. I usually try to avoid adding cards until the deck has kind of become more optimal. But there's also some really nice bonuses like adding a additional target. Sometimes the best thing you can do is, I've got this nice attack 5. Wouldn't it be cool if you could do it again? This is the time to start adding those.
And the last priority is adding those rolling modifiers.
Sadly, since it's way easier to get advantage for players than it is for monsters, rolling modifiers are kind of somewhat problematic and somewhat unpredictable. So as a result, they become much lower priority than actually making your raw draws more important. I don't like that term. As a result, rolling modifiers aren't nearly as important as just improving your base cards to begin with. So, one thing that's actually very important is advantage and rolling modifiers. And this is kind of annoying. So the way advantage works, if you aren't aware, you draw the top 2 cards and take the best. If one is a rolling modifier, you just take both of those, which is annoying. We're like, well, the rolling modifier was already on top. Advantage didn't do anything. That can happen. That's annoying. So as a result, if you actually have a reliable way to get advantage, and there is a locked class that has a million ways to get these, at least a couple of them, maybe you're going to try to avoid some of these rolling modifiers until the very last possible moments, especially if they don't really add much. Especially if there's something like, here's a very conditional rolling modifier, and then you draw that in a miss. You're like, well, I had advantage. Well, that's a miss. And then that's frustrating for those classes that constantly do these. So you'll want to avoid those when possible. However, there are incredibly good rolling modifiers that you should take when you can, because they're just that good. Like if you draw a rolling curse and like, oh, I rolling cursed into a miss. Well, they still get cursed. Oh, I rolling stunned, or I rolled a target into a miss. If you had a rolling stun, okay, well, they didn't take any damage, but they're stunned, or rolling extra target. Well, that missed, but here's another attack on another guy that I just got. Those are incredibly good. And even though they're adding +1s, there's like add 2 or add 3 rolling +1s, those are still very good. So don't just avoid them just because they're rolling modifiers. Take them anyway. And especially if you don't have a way to add advantage, it doesn't actually change the deck at all. Rolling modifiers don't really they make it stack higher, but they don't actually change the chances very much unless you're attacking with advantage, in which case they actually end up kind of reducing the chances of drawing your cards.
That's a trap! Now let's talk about trap perks. Perks that are traps, that are not good. They look like they might be, but they're not.
Just not good. Yeah, Velvet agrees. So, if you get those nice rolling Pierce 3 or rolling Shield 1, and they sound like, oh man, not only do I get my cool modifier, but I get a shield 1 for the rest of the turn, or I get to pierce those annoying enemies. The chance of actually drawing a pierce when you're attacking a shielded enemy where it's going to have impact, if you were probably putting an attack on a shielded enemy, you may have already had pierce lined up. And the attack was just going to kill it anyway. Or you may luckily roll into it and say, I'm just going to do a weak attack and maybe I'll kill that flame demon. Who knows? But if you're just relying on luck to bail you out, it's probably not great. Especially shield. Shield is one of those where I was actually really enthused when I played one specific class that I cannot talk about. And I'm like, this is going to be very good. However, every time I drew it, I'm like, well, the enemies have already gone. Or, the enemies aren't actually attacking this turn. Or like, aha, one enemy gets to attack. And I'm like, I rolled into preventing 1 damage. That's not bad. But then I realized over the course of a retirement, I think I may have prevented 3 or 2 damage with that perk. And it was just because of random happenstance. My favorite part is I got a really early initiative and I attacked the guy with advantage. I got shield and I killed the guy, and then he was just dead and couldn't attack me. And I'm like, this is just how it happened. And you have to realize that their pierce and shield are incredibly just unreliable. And some of the plus target on characters that only melee, it's not a trap, but it's just not as good because you probably aren't getting surrounded. And if you are getting surrounded, you may have multi-attack cards as is. It has some effect, so I'd still take them because plus target is amazing. But it sounds like it's amazing, but it definitely levels out. If you are heavily on ranged attack, plus target is actually very, very good, and definitely take it.
General advice is go for consistency and reliability, something you can control instead of just randomness that may or may not help.
However, there are some cool stuff that it's not necessarily bad, but it's just hard to turn them down randomly. There are some ways to get a disarm, curse, stun, or even infusing elements. If they're important to your class, an element infusion isn't bad, especially like the Mind Thief. He adds +2s, which is already good, and infuse ice. He actually has several ways to use ice, so that's not necessarily bad. And there's some times where you can go, oh, you know what? Now that I've cast Cold Fire with advantage and stunned all these guys, I actually drew a +2 infuse ice on my Spellweaver. I'm going to Stand Potion to get Cold Fire back to do it next turn. You can play around that. You don't necessarily rely on it because really all you're doing with the Spellweaver is trying to add another +2. But now that you're like, well, now that I've got that in play and I know that after my turn's over, ice will be in play, I want to do it again. So you can kind of use those opportunities. You don't plan for them, but they can happen, especially like rolling into a disarm and say, well, I accidentally disarmed that living bones that was going to attack me. It's hard to turn down, but it's not something you should gun for immediately, but they're still good. And there's other ways, just a very minimal amount of classes that can draw invisibility out of their attack modifiers. Now, here's the funny part. Sometimes you actually want to take the hit and you go like, all right, I'll take that guy, finish him off. I'll take that one hit. And you go like, invisibility. Now, of course, you can say, hey, I'm going to ignore the invisibility. You can do that. Anytime you draw a rolling modifier, you don't have to do it. But can you imagine if you were like, well, now that perk is wasted. Now, of course, sometimes you're like, oh, I drew random invisibility. The chance of actually drawing random invisibilities when you didn't necessarily plan for it and then having it pan off immensely is very, again, random. And sometimes you can say, well, I turned invisible, I'm good. And then say, well, now the aggro is going to that Spellweaver and they get attacked and go like, crap. Oh, I didn't want that. So it doesn't always come as at the right moment. And usually, in my opinion, invisibility ends up being incredible when it happens on the person you want to at the moment you want to, not just randomly when drawing attack modifiers.
Yeah, I like things that happen on purpose. Thanks to our patrons at Patreon who voted on our next video, which will be Best Class Combos.
I think you already know what number 1 is. Or do you?
Let us know in the comments what class has the best perks, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Thanks for watching.